Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We are excited to talk about HIPAA security risk assessments. It's a privilege to be here to discuss a topic that is near and dear to my heart, but I know everyone else probably thinks it's the bane of their existence. As with our previous webinars, we invite you to participate as much as you feel comfortable. Feel free to submit questions in the chat, or use the little hand icon to raise your hand, or just unmute yourself, interrupt me, and ask your questions. We want to make sure this time together is as educational as possible, and we want you to use this as a resource. My name is Megan Papaleo, and I work as a security consultant for Strategic Solutions. Strategic Solutions is a healthcare-focused managed services provider, meaning we've performed so many HIPAA security risk assessments. We've been doing them for years to help practices stay HIPAA compliant, fulfill meaningful use requirements, or just manage their regular risks. Today is actually my 8-year anniversary here at SSCA, so that means I have done more security risk assessments than I choose to think about. Today we'll be talking all about the HIPAA security risk assessment. We'll talk about a brief overview of what it is, a few reminders on why it's important, and do a deeper dive into how it's actually done, and then we'll discuss any sort of resources that are available to you to fulfill your security risk assessment requirements. So what exactly is a security risk assessment? For some, if not most, it's a one-time effort put forth so they can check a box. HIPAA, check. Meaningful use, check. Emergency planning, check. But we really want to change the way your mindset is. A security risk assessment is not a one-and-done activity. It's part of a larger risk management process, and it's exactly that. It's a process or a cycle. The security risk assessment is an effort that helps your organization lay out the roadmap for improving the security posture of the organization by documenting how and where your organization is at risk and determining the most appropriate response plans. All of this will help you plan and achieve rapid or quick response and recovery during an emergency. A security risk assessment starts by identifying where all the organization's protected health information, or PHI, lives, as well as the critical assets and processes that really hold up the business. Then we want to look at what the organization is doing to protect that PHI, to protect those assets, to keep those procedures going, and then deciding which current security controls are sufficient and which aren't. Now that we identify those weaknesses, we want to look at the risks that are identified and rank them, prioritizing them based on how they might impact the business. And then we want to take action, put measures in place to reduce the likelihood of the identified risk affecting the business. But honestly, that's not it. The cycle then repeats itself, looking again at the business's assets, its security controls, its risks, evaluating if the security measures put in place are effective, devising and implementing new security measures to be more effective, and so on and so on and so on, each cycle reducing the risk rating and likelihood of impact. This is probably not your first educational session about security risk assessments, so let's take some time to discuss some of the myths that we have definitely heard in the past. Security risk assessments are optional for small providers. They're just for big enterprises. And the truth of the matter is that's just not true. Literally every provider, practice, business associate, covered entity has to complete a security risk assessment on a recurring basis to stay HIPAA compliant. Using a certified EHR makes me compliant. It fulfills the security risk assessment requirement, and unfortunately that's just not true. Just because your EHR system can be used in a compliant way doesn't mean that you are compliant and have fulfilled your security risk assessment requirements. My EHR or my EMR vendor took care of everything. Once again, that's just unfortunately not true. EMR systems are developed so that they can be compliant, but they don't automatically make the rest of your organization compliant. A checklist will suffice for the security risk assessment requirement. If only this was true, wouldn't that make all of our jobs a little bit easier? But unfortunately, no. Again, this is a very involved process where we are using our critical thinking skills to identify assets, risks, ranks, and act on them. A checklist just honestly won't be enough. There is a specific risk assessment method that I must follow. And the good news is that also isn't true. There are many different ways to complete a security risk assessment as long as they combine and use the different elements requested and required by HIPAA regulations. So we can access this and face this in many different ways as long as we are following and including different elements as required by HIPAA. My security risk assessment only needs to look at my EHR. And again, that's just not true. Your EHR system is very important to your security risk assessment, but that's not the only place where protected information, patient information, critical processes are kept. There are many other places that we need to take into consideration and evaluate security risks and threats. I only need to do a security risk assessment once. That just won't be enough for HIPAA. If they come knocking on your door and auditing, do you think that they're going to say, oh, you did a security risk assessment 2 years ago? That's fine. That's good enough. Unfortunately, they're not going to say that. A security risk assessment needs to be done on a recurring basis, at least annually, but also when you're making big changes to your organization, such as a new HR, a new office location, new network equipment, new servers. We want to make sure that we are evaluating our risks on a recurring basis and again when needed. So now that we've talked about what a security risk assessment sort of is, I think it's important to talk about why they are important. One of the most daunting and maybe convincing reasons to perform a security risk assessment is the potential cost to the organization for not completing a security risk assessment. Failing to perform an assessment has been listed as the reason for the HHS to levy fines against an organization in half of all fined cases and in nearly all fined cases where the fines were greater than $1 million. But I believe they're important not just because they're required by the regulating bodies, but because they help to secure and protect your practice, which can help prepare for an emergency, mitigate the impacts of an emergency situation, or even stop certain emergencies from happening altogether. It's the unfortunate truth that practices today are at greater risk than ever. Today, we're seeing a disturbing amount of trends that are driving the risk of a successful attack higher than it's ever been for businesses just like yours. Online criminals have been learning how to circumvent basic security measures. So basically, they've quickly become a lot more sophisticated. Plus, there are more cyber criminals than ever before. And now they've started targeting businesses just like yours. And why? Just like we discussed last week, the cyber criminals know that big companies have invested millions into their security infrastructure, their training infrastructure, and the chances are very good that a smaller business might not be as well protected. And that makes a smaller business or a medium-sized business even a much easier target. And your data is just as valuable to the criminals as a large enterprise's data. At the same time, security has grown increasingly complex. There's so many layers of protection that are required to withstand the type of attacks that we know about now, but every day we're learning about new attacks so that there is just constantly more layers of protection that we need. There's more data, there's more apps in the cloud, there's more mobile devices, there's more people. There's so many things to think about nowadays that we didn't have to think about before. So these threats are rapidly changing. So at this point, you're convinced, right? We all know we need to perform a security risk assessment, but how exactly do we get this done? So as I spoke about before, there is not one specific method you need to use, but there are 9 elements listed by HIPAA regulation that a successful security risk assessment entails. You need to identify where patient information or protected health information is stored, received, maintained, or transmitted. So that means not just your EHR system, but maybe your emails, your printers, your scanners, physically, your office, how is that protected? All sorts of things. We need to figure out exactly where everything is contained. Once we know that, we need to identify and document potential threats and vulnerabilities to the security of that data that we have identified in element 1. We need to assess the current security measures that are used to safeguard PHI. So we need to see what we're currently doing and decide if that's good or not. Once we've done that, we're talking about whether the security measures we have implemented are proper. Are we doing them correctly? Is everything working as it should? And is it enough? Then we need to determine the likelihood of a reasonably anticipated threat. So we need to sort of determine the probability of a threat affecting our business. Once we know the probability, we also want to look at the potential impact each of these identified threats could have to the business and the threat of, breach of our patient information. Once we know that, we're sort of assigning risk levels to the vulnerability and impact combinations. We're documenting the assessment. We're taking action where we're mitigating those risks. And like I said earlier, we're not stopping there. We are continuously looking at our assessment. We're improving the results of our assessment, and we're repeating the assessment as needed. So this first element, identify where PHI is stored, received, maintained, or transmitted. Before you can secure something, you need to know exactly what you're securing. So what things are important to protect in your business? What is most important to identify in this instance is your protected data. Not just your PHI or patient information, but any other data or programs you'll need to continue to function and provide care during an emergency situation. So aside from your patient data, you need to think about the physical equipment in your facility. How could someone gain access and steal equipment that might store sensitive information? Or how could they gain access and compromise your processes for care to your patients? You need to think about your payment or your POS system, because a criminal could easily try to steal customer credit card data. You need to think also about your employee data, such as your employees' social security numbers, your employees' medical information, their health insurance, because all of that stuff is also very valuable data to criminals out there. You need to think about the ability to pay your employees, because a criminal could access your bank account and make payroll sort of difficult or take it away. And then lastly, you might also want to think about financial transactions and banking credentials to prevent access by cyber criminals. Now that we know exactly what data and assets we have that are critical to maintaining business, to maintaining care for our patients, and to maintaining the confidence that our patients have in our security, we want to look at what could threaten the security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those assets. You might remember this graphic from our first few presentations. This is to remind us that we're required to use an all-hazards approach to emergency planning and risk assessment. An all-hazards approach considers a full spectrum of emergencies, disasters, events, including internal events, man-made events, or natural disasters. It may include, but is not limited to, care-related emergencies, equipment and power failures, interruption of communications, loss of your facility or a portion of your facility, and interruptions in normal supply of essentials such as food and water. Rather than managing initiatives and planning for each of these specific events, it's a multitude of threat scenarios, and all hazards planning approach focuses on developing processes, capacities, capabilities, and training for systems that are critical to preparedness for a full spectrum of emergencies and disasters. So all hazards planning does not specifically address every possible threat, but ensures your practice and your providers have the capability to address a broad range of related emergencies. So in addition to these scenarios pictured here, discussed earlier, I think it's also important to talk about and think about specific popular cyber attacks and how that could affect the security of your data. First, and probably most prevalent in your minds, is ransomware. Ransomware is when a cyber criminal gets into your system, locks it up, encrypts the data, keeps it away from you, and holds it for ransom and asks for payment. Or you have to restore your systems from before they were infected. That is very dangerous because it takes away your patient data away from you, and you can't provide care to your patients at that time, but you also have to worry about the confidentiality of their data when it's in the hands of those cyber criminals. Another thing we need to think about when we're doing our all hazards approach planning is the dangers of phishing. Phishing is when a bad actor either uses legitimate credentials to send email and sort of pose as a member of the workforce or a trusted contact, or they trick users into getting their credentials to, again, gain access and pose as a trusted contact or third party. And then they could also use those credentials to get additional access to your environment, to get you to wire payment to them, to get you to send patient information to them. There's so many different ways that they can use a phishing attack to gain access and threaten the security of your data. Insider attack is another sort of cyber attack that is on the rise, and that is when one of your own employees takes advantage of their elevated status, their elevated credentials, their elevated knowledge, or access to patient information to affect the security of your data. So whether that's using social security numbers of your patients to do some sort of Medicare, insurance, or financial fraud on the side, or actively using their access to your system to funnel money or provide access to bad actors knowingly. And then another thing you should also start thinking about is a password attack, and that's just when bad actors find your legitimate passwords on the dark web. Maybe they found it from the LinkedIn breach, or there's a breach of Yahoo or MyFitnessPal. They're finding these legitimate credentials and using them to sort of access your accounts in other third parties. These are all sort of things we need to start thinking about as we're planning, as we're identifying risks, we're identifying threats, and we're identifying vulnerabilities to our organization's data. So once we've completed the reviews of where the patient information, where the protected data, where the PHI is stored in our organization, what is used to interact and access that data, we're assessing and reviewing our current security efforts. It's important to start by documenting your organization's current efforts to safeguard PHI. HIPAA divides the items that should be assessed into 3 categories: administrative safeguards, physical safeguards, and technical safeguards. Each category of the safeguard has a subset of items that must be addressed, and they can't just be addressed in your actions. You also have to have documented policies and procedures that establish your organization's intent to assess, to address, and to protect these items. So it is incredibly important to have a documented list of policies and procedures that address all of these specific items in the administrative safeguards, physical safeguards, and technical safeguards. But it's not just important to have the policies, you also have to do what your policies and procedures say you're going to do. So if you have let's choose one of these, an assigned security responsibility policy. That is essentially assigning security responsibility to an individual or group of individuals. You're saying this person is our HIPAA risk officer, this person is our security officer, this person is our privacy officer, and each of their responsibilities is X, Y, and Z. You have assigned that security responsibility in policy, in documentation, but you also need to follow through and make sure that person is trained in their responsibilities as the HIPAA officer, as the security officer, as the privacy officer. They're trained, they know what they're doing, they're competent, and they are ready to fulfill those policies indeed. So now that we've identified where our data is, we've reviewed what we're currently doing to protect it, it's important to assess whether or not the security measures that we've implemented to protect it are done properly and if they are sufficient. Essentially, there are 3 ways to treat risk once you've identified it. You can remediate the risk by putting measures in place to reduce or eliminate the risk. So basically we're saying, okay, we're not doing so great at this. How can we do better at this? Let's implement a new password policy. Let's make sure our users are kicked off the system if they are inactive. We're remediating that risk. We're taking that risk and making it smaller. Another option we have is to transfer the risk to another entity. So if there's something that maybe we can't do to remediate that risk and make it smaller, we want to sort of put the onus of the risk on someone else. That is where cyber liability insurance really comes into play. We'll talk more about this in our next series, where we're talking about security incident response and cyber liability insurance. But transferring this risk to another entity will help you reduce the impact of the threat or vulnerability. That also ties into making sure our equipment is under warranty. So if your server dies, if your firewall dies, your wireless internet dies, we want to make sure the risk is transferred to that warranty, and we can get replacement assets as quickly as possible to reduce the amount of downtime, to reduce that threat to our environment. And finally, if we can't mitigate that risk or remediate it, if we can't transfer it, our last option is to sort of accept it. And that's just saying, okay, we've made this the smallest risk possible, or there's really nothing we can do about it. We have to accept this risk and hope that it doesn't come back to bite us. So now that we've identified our data, we've evaluated our current efforts to secure it, we have that information, we need to think about the gaps we've uncovered in our safeguards and consider the likelihood of potential threats to our patient information, to our assets, and to our data that may impact the security and integrity of that data. So this is essentially a ranking system that's designed to demonstrate the probability that an identified threat will affect the practice. So I've given a few examples here. Like we said, there is not one method of performing this assessment. There is not one ranking system. There is not one labeling system. So in a qualitative assessment, likelihood can be described in so many different ways. So I've done some here that they sort of rank from rare to likely, from likely to very likely, or low to high. Choose what works best for your organization. What's important is that we are identifying the likelihood of these threats to affect our organization. Once we've figured out sort of our likelihood, once we've figured out our likelihood, we want to look at how much this might impact our business. So if that threat were to be realized, what impact would it have on our business? Would it be a low impact? Would barely anyone feel it? Would it really not affect us that much? Or would it range up to a severe impact? Would it take us down? Would it affect our ability to provide care? We want to sort of identify and once again use whatever system works best for you, but we want to identify how badly we would be hurt if that threat were realized, if that threat or that vulnerability were to happen and take place in our business. And then finally, using our sort of likelihood and impact ratings, we have created sort of a risk matrix that's going to help help us rank each identified threat or vulnerability so that we can understand and rank what is most important. Obviously, things that have a high impact and also a high likelihood are in the red. They're going to have a very high level of attention that we want to pay to it because it's going to impact us the most, and it's also most likely to happen. Those are the things we want to focus on first. Those are the things that are going to be in our roadmap of how we can better secure our organization going forward. We've assigned these risk levels for all the identified threats and security vulnerabilities that we have identified in the previous stages, and then we're ranking them and assigning a level of risk so that we know what to address first. If things are lower in impact, lower in likelihood, they might not be that big of a threat to our organization, but things with a higher impact or a higher likelihood are going to affect us more. So once this is complete, we can sort of document the assigned threat levels and create a list of corrective actions that we can do to better secure our organization. So element 8 is all about documentation and taking action. As we've spoken about earlier, it is important that this isn't just one and done. We're not identifying our threats, our vulnerabilities, our risks, and then saying, okay, well, now we know. We're saying, okay, now we know, and what are we going to do? So it's important to create a plan of action and assign specific teams or specific individuals to address those items, and make sure that the next time we do the security risk assessment or the next time this comes up, we have reduced the risk, we've reduced the threat, we've reduced the impact, and we are showing that we are making progress towards a more secure organization. Another important part of the security risk assessment is that you keep it documented. The HIPAA regulation bodies will ask for your past 6 years of security risk assessments if you are ever to be audited, and so you're expected to maintain documentation of the security risk assessment, but also of your plan of action for at least 6 years. And again, we don't want to stop there. We want to continually and periodically review and update our risk assessment. You know, the security rule doesn't state how often it needs to be done, but we always recommend at least annually and again after any major changes to your organization. A lot can change over the year, let alone 2 or 3 years. Things are rapidly changing constantly, so there's always new threats, there's always new vulnerabilities, and we want to continue to make sure that those new threats and vulnerabilities are included in our risk assessment. You know, if we stop developing the risk assessment and stop paying attention to it, we would still be looking at the threats and vulnerabilities that affect fax machines. But now we have to look at so many different things: two-factor authentication, email, secure email, encrypted devices, VPNs, remote users. There's so many more things that we need to continue to think about and continue to include in our risk assessment. And it's important that this is a continuous cycle, again, not a one and done activity. So there are actually a lot of really great resources out there to help you. This sounds like a very overwhelming experience, an overwhelming process, and it is. It's very involved. There are a lot of things that you need to think about. There are a lot of things that you need to do, but there's some really great technical resources out there. There is a free NIST HIPAA Security Toolkit application, which is a program that will help you run through the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is accepted by HIPAA as a great way to secure your organization. It will sort of take you through the steps that we've talked about. We're going to identify, protect, detect your data, your assets, and your PHI. This is a great tool that will help you sort of run through the security risk assessment, as well as actually the ONC and the OCR HIPAA security risk assessment tool. This is very similar to the NIST tool, but it is specifically for HIPAA and the OCR. It is a local application that you can actually install on your computer, and it asks you a ton of questions so that you can think about specific threats and risks to your environment. You can respond on what you are doing to address that. It's important to be very honest. And then once you've completed all the questions, all the uploads, all the things that it asks, it will help you sort of identify what you might need to work on and give you suggestions for what that looks like moving forward. And as always, please use your great, incredible resource, the Virginia Community Healthcare Association, as well as Strategic Solutions. We are always here and happy to help. Like we said, there is no one right way. There is no one way to do security risk assessment, but it is a very involved process, and we're happy to answer any questions, provide any resources, and sort of just help you out as you go through this assessment process. So I want to go ahead and open up the floor to any questions, see if you guys had any questions before we move forward. You can submit your questions to the chat, unmute, raise your hand, and I am happy to assist. Well, if no one has any questions, I have a question for you. We have an Amazon gift card ready to go. I invite you to quickly put the answer to this question in the chat. The first correct answer will win this Amazon gift card. So our question is, as we spoke about, HIPAA safeguards are divided into 3 categories: administrative, physical, and what else? Yes, perfect. Oh, wow, you guys are quick. Technical, you're right. So Alka will have, oh, look at all of you. Yes. So HIPAA safeguards are divided into administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. Great job. Be on the lookout for that. And we hope before we head off that you will join us in 2 weeks for our next webinar, which is focusing on security incident response. We're going to talk about what happens after an incident, after a hack. What can you do to securely respond? Make sure that you are doing exactly what you need to provide efficient care to your patients. You are working with your cyber liability insurance partner and making sure that we are responding quickly and working through that emergency now that it has sort of happened. Now, I would love to open the floor back up to questions. I encourage you to unmute yourself or submit any questions through the chat. Okay, well, I'm going to assume we are all good to go here. We will be sending out a copy of the slide deck, a recording of this, as well as links to those tools, those resources we talked about, the NIST HIPAA Security Assessment Toolkit, as well as the OCR/ONC HIPAA Security Toolkit. We invite you to reach back out to us with any questions, and we hope we can be of assistance.